The war in Europe is entering its last desperate months. The soldiers and civilians of continental Europe can see the end in sight. Strategists search for solutions that can end the fighting and end the dying. Desperate strategies and tactics are deployed by Germany and Japan in the fantastic hope that somehow the war could be turned around and in some way victory, even a compromised peace, could be snatched from the hands of the Allied enemy, whose war aim is the total defeat of the Axis. The long-awaited invasion of France has taken place with Operation Overlord in June 1944. Armies have fought bitter battles, French cities often destroyed to be liberated. After a struggle of weeks where the Germans had pinned the Allies into Normandy, the American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces broke out and caused the Nazi forces to flee almost to the borders of Germany. In the optimism these victories created, there was an impetus to end the war quickly, before Christmas. The ambition led Allied generals to abandon the patient preparations that had characterized Overlord and made a bold thrust to cross the Rhine and invade Germany. This resulted in the Arnhem airborne attack, the bridge too far. It resulted in defeat for the Allies. The result was the war's prolongation. In the east, the Russian army has rolled back the Germans to the edge of Germany. The Red Army is now a tool, not of the defense of Russia. Its goal, not the defeat of Nazism, but the instrument of Stalin's post-war ambitions. In the Pacific, island after island had been subject to invasion and conquest as the grip of American forces grows ever tighter, and Japan, despite fanatical resistance, faces utter defeat. In Italy, the fighting continued. Following the capture of Rome, the Germans had established another defensive line across the Italian peninsula, which once again had to be broken by frontal assault. The German line of defenses was known as the Gothic Line and stretched across the central Apennine Mountains as they turned across the width of Italy. An ancient Roman road running to the rear of the fortifications enabled the Germans to move reserves and resources from point to point to deal with any Allied attack. The Germans actually outnumbered the Allies in this theater of war, the balance only evened by Allied superiority in air power and supplies. The fighting in France had assumed prime place in Allied plans, and troops were withdrawn from Italy to land in southern France and attack Germany directly. The American command had always regarded the Italian campaign as a distracting sideshow that diverted the alliance from the main task of defeating Nazism in its home. The Americans viewed with suspicion grand British plans to sweep up the leg of Italy and then onto Vienna, coming at the Reich via the back door. The U.S. saw Imperial Britain at work, looking to the post-war world and aiming to become the predominant Mediterranean power. The British were to be frustrated in this ambition and were forced to concede that there could be no grand attack in Italy, rather a series of assaults that would pin down German forces, weakening the overall Nazi strategic position. The Italian countryside was easily defended. The central mountainous spine prevented maneuver, shrinking the fighting onto narrow fronts. As the Allies pushed further north, they encountered large rivers, such as the Po, flowing west to east, which were to form yet another set of formidable natural barriers. The autumn and winter were wet and turned the earth into a glutinous morass, making even the tiniest movement a supreme effort. This was a war fought in the landscape of the Renaissance painting, And it was a terrain where the Renaissance army of men on foot and horse was more at home than a mechanized mid-20th century force. Steep mountains and hills were surmounted by still usefully fortified towns. Countless narrow valleys were cut by stream and river. Every few kilometers, a bridge, demolished by retreating Germans, would have to be rebuilt under the gun sights of the enemy. The Italian fighting of that winter has been described as an engineers' war. It was they who rebuilt the bridges, disarmed the bombs and booby traps. It was they who bulldozed ways through narrow streets of towns and villages, which had been systematically demolished. In the winter, the war became bogged down, and both sides drew back to await the dry weather. For veterans of the 8th Army, who were fighting perhaps their 4th year of war, old soldiers who knew a sideshow when they saw it, the stalemate was relief. In 1939, as the war began, optimism was everywhere. The British people and army sang a popular song which predicted that they would hang out the washing on the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line, named after a hero of Wagnerian Germanic legend, was a line of powerful fortifications along Germany's western border, which ran for more than 450 kilometers and stood opposite the French Maginot Line. While standing in opposition to the French defenses, the German line was more lightly built, a series of infantry pillboxes and anti-tank barriers. It was not designed to be impregnable, rather to slow any attacker, whilst a mobile reserve was brought to bear against the would-be invader. Light as the Siegfried Line was, when built in the 1930s, it still consumed a third of Germany's annual production of building materials and the labor of more than 500,000 men. Although lightweight, the Siegfried Line did deter the French during the Phoney War, and in 1940 the British Army never hung anything on the Siegfried Line, leaving most of its clothes behind at Dunkirk. During the long years of occupation and Nazi dominance, the line was the border with a placid occupied territory and was neglected. As the Western Allies drew near, the Siegfried Line became known as the West Wall and became a battleground. As the autumn of 1944 had turned to winter, the advance of the Allies slowed. Their failure to secure Antwerp and use the port created a crisis of supply. Simply not enough fuel, ammunition, and food were reaching the Allied armies. Hitler became convinced that the Western Allies had overreached and exposed themselves to a devastating counterattack. On December 16th, that attack began. The German forces had made a great effort to trawl through the population and find as many fresh troops as possible. By December 1944, another 150,000 soldiers had been scraped together and had been added to the German army. German industry had made a tremendous last effort and had produced the material, the tanks, the fuel, and the ammunition for a last great offensive. Hitler ambitiously planned to repeat his triumph of 1940. Panzer armies would thrust through the forests of the Ardennes, then swing around to the rear of the British and Americans, then take Antwerp, and the balance of power in the West would swing back to the Nazis. The attack would be made in the deep winter, when weather would ground the Allied air forces. V2 weapons would complete the victory with a devastation of London. An officer who was given command of one of the Panzer armies said, "All Hitler wants me to do is cross a river, capture Brussels, take Antwerp, through the Ardennes, when the snow is waist deep, when it doesn't get light till 8, and it's dark at 4, with divisions of kids and old men. Oh, and at Christmas too. The attack fell on weaker U.S. units and showed as a great indentation in the line separating the two armies. The offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans swept into Belgium, capturing many thousands of prisoners. Yet they underestimated the Americans, who reorganized and reinforced, slowing the German attack. On December 22nd, the weather lifted, and Allied air power began to slowly destroy the Bulge. All through January, the U.S. Army slowly closed around the Germans. The Bulge offensive squandered the very last strength available to the Nazis. Winter closed around the armies and prevented any more fighting. Hitler's decision to attack in the Ardennes, to spend his last strength in the west rather than turn against the Red Army in the east, seems, with a certain clarity of hindsight, to be one of the German dictator's greatest mistakes. In the west, the Germans enjoyed many advantages: natural defenses, the great rivers of Western Europe, and the extensive line of fortifications, such as the West Wall, the Siegfried Line. There was to be no such advantage in the east. The strategic reality was that attacking in the west gave Hitler a slim chance of victory, whereas attack in the east would only serve to postpone the inevitable defeat. The failure of offensive in the Ardennes made the final task of the Red Army easier. Yet, as the Communist Army prepared for that final offensive, the Soviet High Command was presented with difficult strategic choices. The Soviets had begun the war out of desperate self-defense against the 1941 German invasion. They had not embarked upon a war of conquest. Now, though, events had conspired to present a tantalizing prize of expansion to the Communists. The decision was not how to defeat Germany, but how to make best use of the peace. The Russians enjoyed a simple and large numerical advantage that enabled them always to have a strategic reserve, always to have something held back with which to hit the Nazis. An exception to the domination of Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union is in Yugoslavia, a country where communist partisans under Joseph Tito are about to liberate their country from the German occupiers without the help of any foreign army. This will make Yugoslavia unique in the post-war world. In the winter of 1944, two very similar military forces faced very different fates. The British Home Guard was disbanded in December 1944. Formed in the spring of 1940 as a Nazi invasion seemed imminent, the force performed a multitude of the simplest military tasks, and, if nothing else, it allowed the regular army to concentrate on training and equipping new recruits. The Home Guard kept vigil on airfields and factories. It manned roadblocks and captured downed Luftwaffe pilots. Originally composed mostly of men too old and those few too young for military service, the reality of the Home Guard was different to any television comedy. As Britain's position became more secure and the threat of invasion became more remote, the Home Guard was integrated into the regular army and attached to regular units. Membership, once voluntary, became compulsory, and the Home Guard became a preschool for military service, devoted to preparing young men of 17 and 18 for their eventual conscription. There came to be as many as 750,000 Home Guards. Far from being a dad's army, the average Home Guardsman was under 30 years of age. The Home Guard was for many a pleasant wartime hobby, some members actually resenting any compulsory service, such as when Home Guards were ordered to man anti-aircraft artillery. As the Home Guard marched before their king through the streets of London, the British amateur soldiers ended their service never having faced the ultimate test by having to meet their country's enemy in battle. The German Volkssturm mobilized as the British disbanded. All German men between 16 and 60 were drafted into service. For the German Home Guard, the experience was not one of increasing routine and organization. Rather, it was of descent into anarchic chaos against the invaders, with supplies becoming more scarce. It was a force not organized by the traditional German army, but by the Nazi Party. Towards the end of the war, the SS was rounding up civilians and driving them at gunpoint to fight the invaders. It was no hobby, as the elderly and children went out with handheld rocket launchers to face elite Allied soldiers. If any in the Allied nations doubted what all the fighting was for, whether all the deaths were in vain, in the last months of fighting in Europe, as Allied soldiers entered the territory of the Third Reich, conclusive and devastating proof of the evil of Nazism was found as the death and concentration camps were uncovered. Nazism in its genesis had been anti-Semitic to its very core. Jews were blamed for all of Germany's misfortunes, blamed for the First World War, blamed for any ill that befell Germanic peoples. It was always dangerous to be Jewish in the Nazi state, but the violence had been arbitrary, the product of street gangs and unsympathetic law enforcement. But with the conquest of Poland, a policy of gathering the Jewish population into ghettos and then effectively starving the Jewish population in those ghettos was implemented. Following the invasion of Russia, special SS death squads were ordered to follow behind the armies and ethnically cleanse the countryside of Jews by mass shootings. History cannot hide the fact that Ukrainians, ethnic Romanians in southern Russia, and Lithuanians were only too happy to assist the Nazis in their evil work. The work of these death squads horrified many ordinary German soldiers who witnessed the killings as bystanders. The final solution was then introduced. The systematic industrialized murder of all Jews was carried out in secret and in remote places. Victims would be deported to camps far from home under the guise of resettlement. The final solution was not a monolithic single historical event. Some camps, Treblinka, Chelemo, and Sobibor, were death camps for the purpose of mass murder alone. At the camp with the greatest notoriety, Auschwitz-Birkenau, extermination was combined with slave labor. The children, the sick, and the aged were killed on arrival by gassing. The able-bodied were tattooed and assigned to be worked to death. The Soviet forces in the East encountered the horrors of the death camps largely after they had been abandoned in the face of the Red Army's advance. Many of the horrific images that have come down to us are the comparatively less brutal slave labor camps, such as Belsen and Dachau, established before the final solution was devised. These places were found by the Western armies. The inhabitants of these camps were often deportees from the Eastern camps, The images of such infernal brutality speak for themselves. 6 million Jews were to die.
I've been here 8 days, and never in my life have I seen such damnable ghastliness. This morning we buried over 5,000 bodies. We don't know who they are. Behind me you can see a pit which will contain another 5,000. There are 2 others like it in preparation.
We actually know now what has been going on in these camps. I know personally what I am fighting for.
The war had begun with Germany's Air Force, the most feared and effective in the world. The last year of fighting was to see the utter prostration of the Luftwaffe. As the bombers of the RAF and U.S. Army Air Force pounded the cities of Germany to rubble, long-range fighters systematically shot down the Luftwaffe fighter force. By 1945, the Allied air forces had come to enjoy what is now called air supremacy. Allied planes were free from the threat of German fighters and were able to attack any target at any time, anywhere in Germany. The result was an oil famine. As every oil refinery and synthetic oil factory were destroyed, the remaining tanks and vehicles ground to a halt. The German transport system was utterly destroyed. Hardly a train or individual truck was able to move the shortest distance without inviting destruction from the air. Above all, the consequence of air supremacy was the terrible, methodical demolition of Germany's cities, killing thousands and creating a multitude of homeless. In February 1945, one of the most controversial raids of the strategic bombing campaign was made on Dresden. 800 British Lancasters and 300 American flying fortresses attacked the East German city, until then untouched by the war. Dresden was not a center of industry. It was a city famed for architectural beauty. Dresden was crammed with civilians fleeing the Russians. 50,000 were killed in one night as the bombers raised a firestorm on the city. Dresden produced a shockwave of doubt among the Allies. Even Churchill doubted the rightness of the raid. The debate on the morality and effectiveness of the air war will last forever. The fact remains, though, that the war in Europe was shortened by the attacks. The war brought forward many new technologies. The air war was no different. In January 1945, just as the Allies had all but driven the German fighters from the skies, the Luftwaffe deployed a new aircraft, the first operational jet fighter, the Me-262. The tremendous speed of the new plane made the 262 invulnerable. Yet, it was a weapon that arrived too late and in too few numbers to save the Reich. As Allied armies were fighting on the borders of Germany, the United States Army Air Force unleashed a campaign of heavy, unrestricted area bombing on the cities of Japan. Bases built on captured islands were used to launch mass attacks by giant B-29 bombers that aimed to pulverize the Japanese islands. The decision was taken to attack the wooden cities with incendiary bombs, echoing the methods of the RAF in Germany and abandoning the usual American tactic of precision attacks on industrial and military targets. On February 25th, 150 B-29s made a huge attack on the Japanese capital and burnt away 2.5 square kilometers of Tokyo. The U.S. Air Force then altered the role of the B-29 to make the attacks even more devastating. The heavily armed B-29 was designed to fly at high altitude. It was now to fly at low level and at night, and was stripped of its defensive gunners. Less fuel was needed, and so the plane could carry even more bombs. In early March, 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo and raised a firestorm. The giant fire destroyed a quarter of the city and killed 85,000 civilians. In the coming month, every major Japanese city was attacked and destroyed by planes using these tactics. A month later, and the B-29s began to systematically destroy the lesser industrial cities. In the southern Pacific, the long fight for the liberation of the Philippine Islands from Japanese domination continued. U.S. General MacArthur, a man for whom the islands had been a second home, had vowed to return to liberate the territory. Although a landing had been made in October 1944, U.S. forces were embroiled in a long fight through the large islands and the scattered archipelagos of islets. The Japanese forced their enemy to fight for every meter of territory on the road to the Philippines' capital, Manila. It was another battle where a town had to be virtually destroyed to be freed from occupation. In February, 16,000 Japanese and nearly 100,000 Filipino civilians died. The Philippines had been part of the grand Japanese scheme to liberate Asia from European domination. Many Filipinos were proud of their westernized attitude. The islands harbored the only serious organized resistance movement against the Japanese, partisans who aided the American forces in fighting their occupiers. As the Japanese were pushed to the remote areas of the islands, MacArthur was to show a style of leadership that was to characterize his role in the post-war world. He embraced and forgave those Filipinos who had collaborated with the Japanese, seeing a stability based on forgive and forget as the best future for the liberated territory. In February 1945, perhaps the most famous land battle of the Pacific War was fought, as yet another amphibious attack was mounted by the U.S. Navy. They attacked the island of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was one more stepping stone on the path towards invasion of Japan, a base from which attacks could bring the war home to the people of Japan. The island was part of a volcanic archipelago. Its name translates to Sulphur Island. The volcanic geology made trenches and dugouts in which soldiers took cover too hot to endure. It was earth from which issued poisonous volcanic gases. It was a landscape of razor-edged ridges, deep ravines, and natural caves, a natural fortress onto which the Japanese defenders had piled layer upon layer of concrete and steel fortification. The conflict followed the same grim script which had directed the fighting on other islands. With each island, as the fighting grew ever nearer to Japan, the determination of the defenders reached new levels of passion. More than 110,000 U.S. Marines were resisted by just 22,000 Japanese. The Japanese did not oppose the landing. They allowed the massive naval bombardment to fall on empty defenses. They allowed the American forces to land, and then engaged the invaders at close quarter with hand-to-hand fighting, where weight of bombardment and air power were neutralized, and individual fighting spirit would give the advantage. The battle was fought meter by meter. The Japanese made a last stand in a narrow, rocky gorge, little more than half a kilometer in length. It took U.S. forces 10 days of constant combat to defeat the defenders, who had to be killed man by man. A third of the Marines became casualties, and the battle passed into legend. The image of Marines raising the stars and stripes on Iwo Jima became an American icon of victory. In February 1945, the leaders of the Allies had come together to discuss the strategy of the war at Yalta in the Russian Crimea. Yalta was a decisive moment in the timeline of the war, in that it was a meeting not about the conduct of the war, but more about the post-war peace. Already, Churchill and Stalin had made an agreement to effectively partition Eastern Europe. They had assigned crude percentages of influence. Britain was to have 90% of the influence in Greece. Bulgaria and Romania were to be 90% Soviet. Yalta agreed the shape of the future United Nations organization. Yalta agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation. The conference also decided the post-war fate of Poland. Poland's freedom was the original cause of the war. Poland had been Britain's ally at a time when the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had made pacts of friendship. As the leaders met, Polish troops were dying and fighting alongside the armies of America and Britain. Yet at Yalta, in return for a promise by Stalin to enter the war against Japan, the Soviet Union was to be given Eastern Poland. The Polish government that had fled in 1939 was to be abandoned in favor of a communist puppet government. At Yalta, the alliance was already dissolving into self-interest. Roosevelt made a secret deal with Stalin, hidden from Churchill, to reward the USSR even more with territory in Asia. Yalta was to condemn many thousands to die. Stalin demanded the return of any Soviet citizens in the West, prisoners of war, Soviet anti-communists who had gone over to the Nazis. The fate of these people, even genuine prisoners of war who had fought bravely for the Soviet Union, was mostly death or the Gulag. Amongst the leaders who sat in conference at Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt was unique in that he was the only one of the three that subjected his war leadership to the judgment of his country. Churchill sat atop a wartime coalition that had effectively suspended British democracy for the duration. Stalin was, of course, a dictator whose power depended on fear and violence. The Russian was in many ways an even greater dictator than Hitler, who had come to power through democracy and enjoyed genuine popular German support. The machinery of the U.S. Constitution, however, would not stop for war. And in November 1944, Roosevelt stood for election for a record fourth term. Roosevelt won, yet his victory was not a landslide. He led his Republican opponent Thomas Dewey 413 to 118 votes in the U.S. Electoral College. In the popular vote, Roosevelt won 23 million votes to Dewey's 20 million. It was a demonstration of why America was fighting the war, a proof of democracy's strength when pitted against dictatorship. Roosevelt attended Yalta, a secretly sick and dying man. His death on April 10, 1945, at the age of 63, came as a stunning surprise to the world. Many U.S. servicemen refused to believe the news. On that day, Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in as 33rd President. Truman was little known and thought to lack experience. Within minutes of his swearing in, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson drew Truman aside and revealed to him the greatest secret of the war, a new explosive, the atomic bomb. The Allies had first reached German territory in the West as early as October 1944. They had seized, after fierce defense, the German town of Aachen on the Dutch border. In fact, the real border of Germany, that which posed the true obstacle, was the River Rhine. This was to be the last major barrier to the Allies. Their first objective was to clear the approaches to the river's west bank and then seize a river crossing. Most troops found the river crossings demolished by the Germans. But at Remagen, U.S. troops captured a bridge by accident. In the south, U.S. General George Patton surprised German defenders with an improvised attack and seized the bridge at Mainz. In the north, Bernard Montgomery made elaborately planned attacks that captured more bridgeheads. In the space of 3 weeks, the Western Allies had seized the eastern bank of the Rhine and stood ready for the final act of the West European War. One of the first moves was to surround the Ruhr, the industrial region of Germany. Stalin was convinced that a secret deal existed between the Western Allies and Germany, that Germany would make no resistance to the Allied attacks in the West in order to strengthen the position of America and Britain in post-war Europe. The orders under which soldiers fought and died were now the product of political rivalries for power in post-war Europe. Churchill wanted the Allies to race to Berlin to reach the German capital before the Russians. Instead, the Americans had their way, and the decision was taken to allow the Russians to take Berlin. As the war in Germany neared its end, German forces in Italy were still providing the Allies with stiff opposition. In early April, the Allied armies, which had been brought to a standstill by the Germans in the winter, opened a massive offensive upon the German defensive lines. The Allies mounted devastating air raids and heavy artillery bombardments. Time and time again, German defenders expected a subsequent infantry attack, only to be hit again by heavy bombardment. Eventually, when that infantry attack came, it enjoyed the special training and special equipment that bridged the obstacles of the Italian terrain. The resistance of the Germans finally broke, and they were trapped with their backs to the River Po. Heavy equipment and vehicles were lost, and retreating Germans were forced to flee to safety. Bologna fell to the Allies on April 21st. Partisans had risen up in revolt and had taken over the cities of Milan and Turin. The Italian people, who had begun the war as enemies, welcomed the Allied soldiers as liberators. On April 28th, as Hitler sat in his Berlin bunker, contemplating the death of both himself and of Nazism, the end came for the Italian fascist dictator Mussolini. Mussolini had planned to escape to the Italian Alps and lead a last stand. Driving in disguise through partisan-held territory, he was captured and shot. His body, with that of his mistress, was hung from a lamppost in a street in Milan. Iwo Jima was a dread warning of what might lie in store for the U.S. armies who were to take part in the last great battle of the Pacific War at Okinawa. In the numbers and scale of operation, only the Overlord landings in Normandy exceeded the Pacific invasion of Okinawa. A little more than 500 kilometers from mainland Japan, Okinawa would be the penultimate step. the U.S. committed more than 500,000 troops and 1,200 warships. The U.S. fleet was joined by the British Pacific Fleet. Massive preliminary bombardments by ships and planes preceded the landings on April 1st. As at Iwo Jima, the commander of the Japanese withdrew his forces inland, concentrating them into fortified defensive positions. His aim was not to repel the invasion, but to simply kill as many invaders as possible. 6 days after the landings, the Japanese Navy mounted massive kamikaze attacks. More than 1,900 kamikaze missions were flown and caused Allied losses which were without precedent. The largest total of kamikaze attacks was matched by what was perhaps the largest individual suicide mission. The Yamato, the largest battleship in the world, was dispatched on a kamikaze mission of its own. It was to smash its way through the Allied fleets and beach itself on Okinawa, thus becoming an unsinkable giant battery. The battleship was, however, sunk en route to its mission. The fighting lasted from April to June 22nd. Of 77,000 Japanese defenders, less than 1/10 were captured to become prisoners. 36 U.S. warships were sunk, mostly through kamikaze attacks. Nearly 5,000 U.S. sailors, nearly 8,000 Marines and soldiers were killed, nearly 32,000 wounded, and over 750 U.S. aircraft shot down. Okinawa made it clear to the United States that the Japanese would exact a horrific price of any invader of the Japanese home islands. It was this price that lay heavily upon the shoulders of those who were to command the U.S. forces. It is perhaps a measure of the utter and total nature of the defeat inflicted upon Germany that there was to be no resistance to the occupying Allied armies. As the territory of the Reich was fought over and destroyed, Hitler had ordered the construction of what he called the National Redoubt. This was to be a fortified region based in the mountains of southern Bavaria, the home of Nazism. The National Redoubt was to be manned and defended by the werewolves, fanatical Nazi terrorists who would act as an underground resistance. Hitler's deputy, Martin Bormann, said, "The werewolf has been born of National Socialism. It makes no allowances and knows no consideration as imposed on regular troops. Hatred shall be our prayer, revenge our battle cry." The werewolves of 1945 became as unreal as any fairy tale monster. In World War II, cities were to prove powerful fortifications, better perhaps than the complex, specially built structures such as the Maginot Line. The maze of streets lined with solidly constructed public buildings, themselves labyrinths of corridors and passages, were ready-made for defenders. The sewers, the tunnels, and the cellars became ready-made bunkers. The more demolished by artillery and air bombardment, the more easily defended the cities became. As Russian armies pressed ever closer to Berlin, Hitler retreated to his bunker deep beneath the city. All through the spring of 1945, the Russians amassed troops for the final battle. On April 10th, this massive force was unleashed. In spite of the desperate position of the Third Reich, there was no lack of Germans prepared to fight to the very last in the defense of Berlin. By April 26th, 460,000 Russians with 1,500 tanks, 13,000 guns, and 26,000 rocket launchers surrounded the inner city center. The city's civilians cowered in the cellars under shell fire, without food or water. Behind the advancing Russians of the front line came a second wave of Soviet troops, some of them freed prisoners of war, bent on revenge with the mass murder, rape, and looting of civilians. Many of those Nazis who fought in this last battle were, by the chance of war, Belgian, Dutch, or French, who had volunteered to fight communism. With the Russians meters away, Hitler committed suicide. An hour before Hitler's death, Soviet soldiers had taken the Reich's chancellery. Hitler had appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, as leader of the German people. Some of those who remained in power after Hitler's death believed in a fantasy that a truce preparatory to peace talks could still be arranged. The only answer the Russians gave was a demand for unconditional surrender and even heavier shelling. On May 2nd, the German forces defending Berlin requested a ceasefire, and at 3 p.m., the Russian guns fell silent. The last great battle of the European war had been fought, with a terrible toll of death. In the 3 weeks of fighting for Berlin, the Red Army had lost 10% of its strength, the heaviest losses of the war, apart from the great collapses of the early years of Barbarossa. The last days of the Reich were dominated by attempts to avoid the wrath of the Russians. Dönitz attempted to buy time for Eastern armies to make fighting withdrawals. The forces in the West were surrendered piecemeal. On May 4th, the Netherlands, Denmark, and northwestern Germany surrendered to British General Montgomery. On May 5th, the Germans offered to surrender to all American forces, again hoping to buy time. Eisenhower told the Germans unconditional surrender were the only terms on offer. It was agreed all German forces would cease operations on May 8th. The surrender was signed at Reims in France, at Eisenhower's headquarters. Stalin suspected treachery and demanded a separate surrender be signed in Berlin. May 8th was designated Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. In Europe, vast tides of humanity, waves of misery, swept through ruined streets and cities, desperately seeking for food, shelter, and safety amongst the wreckage of civilization. In every city, town, and village of Britain and America, ecstatic crowds filled the streets to celebrate the victory. Next time, on World War II, The Complete History, the world awakens from the party of VE Day to realize that a war remains to be fought. The final act of the tragedy of the war is played out in the Pacific Ocean. Fate has catapulted Harry S. Truman to the center of events. The largely unknown U.S. politician projected into the presidency by the death of Franklin Roosevelt now finds that he must make a decision which will end the war at a stroke. His grim choice is whether or not to deploy the atomic bomb against the cities of Japan. The forces of Soviet communism continue fighting some days after VE Day, ensuring the map of Europe is a reflection of Stalin's paranoia and suspicions. At the Potsdam Conference, Germany is divided and dismembered, divisions that will last for nearly 2 generations. At Potsdam, A new face represents Britain, as Winston Churchill loses the post-war election. In the ruins of Europe, a swirling mass of humanity struggles to rebuild a continent, and the United States Marshall Plan is devised to create a stable future. India becomes free of the British Empire. In the French colony of Vietnam, a struggle begins for liberation. The Iron Curtain falls as the Soviet Empire is created, with all of Eastern Europe falling under the domination of the Soviet Union.